Hey guys, welcome back to Wrestle News 365. Hope everyone is doing very well. As always, there is a ton of news stories to get into today. So let's start off talking about AEW, talking about the newest AEW star, the newest addition to the AEW roster, that being Andrade El Idolo, and his new manager, Vickie Guerrero, has spoken about Andrade's career in WWE. Now, Vickie Guerrero, AEW manager, coach, whatever you want to call her, whatever the definition is for managers in AEW. I think they call them coaches, don't they? Or does that lead to actually producers? I don't know. Manager. Let's stick with manager. AEW manager Vickie Guerrero has recently shared her opinion that Andrade El Idolo was lost in the shuffle during his tenure with WWE. Now, of course, Andrade El Idolo stunned the wrestling world by making his debut in Tony Khan's All Elite Wrestling promotion just a couple of weeks ago. Now, Vickie Guerrero gave him a fitting introduction in front of the AEW crowd. The Mexican superstar quickly made his plans clear and stated he wants to become the face of All Elite Wrestling. He also did an interview this past week with Jim Ross on Dynamite, spoke about wanting opportunity, spoke about wanting to challenge for the AEW World Championship, spoke about wanting to challenge for the TNT Championship, possibly as well teased a surprise for next week as well, so we'll touch on that in a second. But in an interview with It's Our House podcast, Vickie Guerrero discussed numerous topics, most notably how Andrade's career panned out in WWE. She said, quote, "I think he was really underutilized in WWE, and that's just my personal opinion, and I think there's just a lot of talent in one show, and it's the basic recipe that a lot of promotions face." And now Vickie Guerrero said she's confident that her alliance with Andrade will lead to bigger things in AEW for the Mexican star. She said, quote, "But I think he's going to have a really great time in All Elite Wrestling. Number one, it's because he's working with me. And number two is there's just a lot of great wrestlers here in All Elite Wrestling. And that's going to be, he's going to be able to have these incredible matches with." Now, Vickie Guerrero, this is really interesting. Now, she also really revealed some comments about when she found out that Andrade was even going to be signing with AEW, when she was going to be working with him. She said, quote, that she initially found out about her pairing with Andrade on the day that the Mexican star actually eventually made his debut. She said, quote, "I knew the day of that I was going to be working with him. Tony Khan makes all the decisions in All Elite Wrestling. So when he said, 'Hey, I have someone for you to come and meet,' and when I went to the trailer and I saw him, I was just ecstatic. I've never met him personally. So to be able to sit down and talk with him, he's such a polite gentleman and so humble, and I think we're just going to have some great times in All Elite Wrestling." Now, obviously, Vickie Guerrero's had nothing but praise for Andrade so far, and the Vickie Guerrero-Andrade pairing, and okay, I'll touch on her first comment first, and we'll get onto the Andrade pairing, because I do have quite a few opinions on it, and I think quite a few people do as well. When she says about Andrade being lost in the shuffle in WWE, I mean, there's no doubt. There's no doubt he was lost in the shuffle in WWE. He wasn't utilized to the best of his ability. You look at what I kind of look at NXT as, especially during his time there, Andrade, because this is still the time of being a one-hour show on the WWE Network and not many people paying attention to the weekly product, paying attention to takeovers. It was very apparent, wasn't it, that Andrade could do great things in WWE. And he could be maybe the heir apparent to Rey Mysterio. WWE have tried to replace Rey Mysterio a million different times throughout his history with the company. Whether it's Sin Cara, Kalisto, Andrade, Alberto Del Rio, the list goes on and on. Humberto Carrillo, Angel Garza, they've brought in these guys with the attempt, hopefully, to replace Rey Mysterio, because Rey Mysterio gets older. Obviously, he's had a ton of injuries during his career. It got to the point where eventually they replaced Rey Mysterio with Rey Mysterio. They brought back Rey Mysterio, and he's now back doing great things on WWE television, challenging for the Universal Championship this past week on SmackDown against Roman Reigns inside of a Hell in a Cell. The reason Rey Mysterio is still in the prominent position that he is in WWE is because they haven't been able to create a replacement. Why? Because you can't replace Rey Mysterio. But one of the names they hoped would eventually replace Rey Mysterio was Andrade. Andrade had a ton of fantastic matches against Rey Mysterio in WWE. But like anything, and like a lot of stars in WWE, Vince McMahon, for whatever reason, changes his opinion. I know Paul Heyman was a big advocate. I know he's an advocate for Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns, but when he was the executive director of Monday Night Raw, he was a big advocate for Andrade. That's why the likes of Andrade, Angel Garza, Zelina Vega, that stable got heavily pushed on Raw, because Paul Heyman was a big fan of him. And like many talents, one being Aleister Black and others, Once Paul Heyman was removed as the executive director of Monday Night Raw, talents like Andrade just fizzled out and went down the card because Vince McMahon obviously wasn't a fan. It became very obvious quickly who was and wasn't a fan during that period of time. Paul Heyman was a fan of Andrade. Paul Heyman was a fan of Aleister Black. Vince McMahon was a bit on the fence. Once Paul Heyman's gone, suddenly the ones that Vince McMahon, the names Vince McMahon isn't a fan of or wasn't a fan of, they started to disappear, and that's what happened with Andrade. And it was a shame, and it is a shame because he could have done great things. In NXT, he did great things. The matches he had against Johnny Gargano, Aleister Black, the list goes on, was tremendous, absolutely tremendous. So it's a massive shame. It's a massive shame that it didn't work out, and I guess he's just the latest name. He's hardly the first, and he definitely won't be the last name that got lost in that WWE corporate shuffle and the way WWE goes through talent and that creative process. That creative process has failed big names throughout its history, and Andrade unfortunately is just the latest name. Now, will Andrade have success in AEW? I think he will. I think he will because of his talent. The style is certainly different in AEW, and certainly names in the past that pro wrestling fans have felt were underutilized or maybe should have been used better or were being booked badly in WWE have had success in AEW. Miro, obviously it took time for him to get really to that success. He had about a year of just bad booking in AEW. Brody Lee, of course, came in. Great booking. Even looking at names like Cody Rhodes, obviously, in WWE, he requested his release because he wasn't being booking great. I know there's a big period of time between Cody Rhodes' WWE release and being in AEW, and of course he's an EVP, but you look at names like FTR as well, and these names that have come into AEW that arguably weren't being booked in the best way, and a lot of people felt they had been lost in the shuffle as well. They've done well in AEW so far, and I think Andrade will as well. No disrespect to Vickie Guerrero, because there was a period of time there in WWE during the late 2000s when she was obviously, the wife, fiance of Edge on SmackDown, the general manager of SmackDown, where she was the top heel in the company. She just was. In terms of generating heat, in terms of generating a negative reaction from the audience, nobody could draw more legitimate heat than Vickie Guerrero. Go back and watch those episodes of SmackDown. Go back and watch those episodes of even after the fact, a couple of years later, when she was the general manager of Raw, she's the manager for Dolph Ziggler. She still generated a ton of heat at that period of time. Vickie Guerrero could generate a reaction from an audience like nobody else because of the excuse me catchphrase, because of the way her voice sort of shrieks and her screaming and her over-the-top presentation. Again, you could have those promos, and I remember seeing the reports, certainly you could see it on SmackDown at the time, where Vickie Guerrero would come out and talk, and genuinely, even on television, let alone inside the arena, but on television, you couldn't hear what Vickie Guerrero was saying. The fans were booing her that loudly. She had that much heat, and legitimate heat. People didn't like her. She's one of those heels that maybe the last of a dying breed, in the sense that people legitimately hated her, and eventually over time they hated her so much that eventually they turned to like her. Eventually, right towards the end, when she left WWE and she threw Stephanie McMahon in that mud pile or whatever it was. And I think people, once they got to the sort of closing stages of Vickie Guerrero's career, it was more of a case of, again, we're booing you because we love to boo you. We love to hate you kind of deal. Is Vickie Guerrero the right manager for Andrade in AEW? I really have my reservations. I'll be totally honest with you. I really have my doubts. Vickie Guerrero now isn't the Vickie Guerrero of 2008, 2009. She's not the Vickie Guerrero that generates that kind of heat. The character of Vickie Guerrero, with the excuse me, with the shrieks, does feel a bit passé. It does feel a bit old. And the reason why it feels old is because it's over 10 years old at this point. It's over... That whole excuse me thing stuff started in like 2007, 2008. So what we're looking at, something being like 12, 13 years old at this point. It's old and it hasn't evolved. And Vickie Guerrero over time in WWE transitioned more from, a serious heel general manager figure into kind of a comedic manager. She was so over the top, and she became so over the top with the shrieks and the mocking of her voice and all this kind of stuff, is that she became, again, slightly comedic towards the end. And she's kind of been that in AEW, and even as a manager in AEW, she's really done nothing so far of note. Yes, she's been the manager of Nyla Rose, but again, Nyla Rose hasn't done anything of note. And now she's feuding with Britt Baker, but was Vickie Guerrero even the manager of Nyla Rose while she was the AEW World's Women's Champion? I don't even know if she was. I recall, I think Nyla Rose was still on her own when she lost the Women's Championship to Hikaru Shida last year at Double or Nothing. So, again, what have Vickie Guerrero and Nyla Rose done as a pairing? Not much. it's not like, Vickie Guerrero's had all of this success and she's got all of this momentum in AEW that she's going to bring towards Andrade. I don't know if I really see that. And, frankly, you can argue as well, as Vickie Guerrero isn't the best promo in the world either. She's not. What generated so much heat for her in WWE, again, was the catchphrase and her voice, the shrieking voice. Look back to the Andrade debut, the Andrade El Idolo debut on Dynamite a couple of weeks ago. The crowd didn't even really understand what she said. She said, Andrade El Idolo, and the crowd didn't really hear it. They were like, what? And Andrade comes out, no entrance music, no graphic. He just walked out, and he got a bit of a reaction, but it just wasn't the debut that I think a lot of people thought it was going to be. So I certainly have my reservations. I'll be really honest. I really do have my reservations about how well the pairing of Andrade and Vickie Guerrero can work out. I mean, I could be wrong. And again, they teased a possible surprise for this week's Dynamite on Saturday nights. Vickie Guerrero is going to be teaming with Nyla Rose to be facing Britt Baker and Rebel. I still think there's a possibility that Zelina Vega could come into AEW. We haven't heard that much about her in WWE since those reports a couple of weeks ago. And, of course, since then, her husband's been fired by WWE and Aleister Black, Tommy End, who also is rumored to be coming into AEW once his non-compete contract clause expires with WWE. So I still think there's a chance Zelina Vega shows up. And maybe it's a situation where Vickie Guerrero is kind of the leader of the stable, but once again, Thea Trinidad is managing Andrade. If AEW can pull that off, then you look at Andrade and say, okay, now he really can go and make money in AEW. He can be a world champion. Because Andrade does have that potential, but I think when we've seen him do his promo on Dynamite and when we saw the sit-down interview with Jim Ross, it's very apparent that, yes, he has taken great strides to improve his English, but he still does have a very thick accent. And not that that's a bad thing. Again, I'm not one of those people that really matters to me. I watch UFC promos and UFC countdown shows all the time where the talent doesn't speak English and you just read the subtitles. It doesn't matter. You're still hyped up. But I guess, it doesn't hurt to have the mouthpiece to go back and forth in the segments. And maybe that's where you need someone like Zelina Vega, Thea Trinidad, as opposed to a Vickie Guerrero. But time will only tell when it comes to that one. Time will only tell. Another story I wanted to talk about was Evil Uno. Evil Uno and WWE. And this is kind of, to be honest, a familiar story when it comes to a lot of AEW talent, especially, the talent that was there earlier on and even the talent that's appeared on Dark before eventually signing with AEW. Now, on a recent episode of Talk is Jericho, the Dark Order's Evil Uno and Stu Grayson were on the show and spoke about how they got to AEW. Now, Chris Jericho asked Evil Uno and Stu Grayson if they'd ever received any offers from WWE throughout their careers. And Evil Uno noted this really interesting story. He said, quote, surprisingly enough, the only tryout offer I got was once I was offered a contract here. I never seeked for it either. In my first, I'd say 9 years, I just thought it was an impossible feat because I wasn't ginormous. I'm a little masked guy who's a video game character, and I'm from Canada. So in my mind, I was like, that's not even my goal because I had it instilled in my brain that as a kid that I can't get there. Which is I find just fascinating that also Stu Grayson spoke about that he got an offer when he was doing some stuff for TNA in the mid-2000s. But the Evil Uno story there is not atypical. We have seen this time and time again. And it goes to reaffirm my point that I've made time and time again, speaking about AEW and speaking specifically about WWE as well. We see this all the time. We see this all the time with WWE, don't we? We don't even watch AEW. AEW is not competition. We don't watch AEW. That's not competition. Triple H says it on his media calls. We don't pay attention. We just pay attention to what we're doing. Oh, we don't pay attention to anything like that. Are you what? There's another program. There's another pro wrestling promotion. Oh, we don't know anything about that. We don't know anything about that. We don't pay any attention. Well, again, you go back to 2019 and they're handing out these giant contracts to people, paying people to stay at home because they don't want them to go to AEW. Now WWE decided they don't want to pay those contracts, so they're releasing those people they gave those big contracts out to. And again, we've seen this time and time again. I think the Acclaimed mentioned it. We've got a story about Anthony Bowens to talk about in a minute, but the Acclaimed, they mentioned it as well. Yeah, we appeared on AEW Dark. We did a couple of matches, and then wouldn't you know it, phone call Vince McMahon, not Vince McMahon himself, but WWE going, hey, why didn't you come into NXT? Why didn't you come in for a tryout? Why didn't you come in and see if you want to join NXT or WWE? And by that point, I mean, it's yet to work, hasn't it? I think maybe was it Ben Carter's the only guy that did some matches for AEW Dark and eventually went to WWE, and that's just because he wanted to work in the UK and he's working for the NXT UK brand. That was it. Apart from that, WWE have tried this a few times now, and pretty much universally, most people have turned them down. Big stars. I mean, you've had a couple of people that weren't signed to AEW, and WWE have had tryouts and stuff like that. But the big names that WWE subsequently hands out contracts to, whether it's Ricky Starks, whether it's Powerhouse Hobbs, whether it's Evil Uno, whether it's the Acclaimed, whether it's whoever, they see him on AEW television, they go, oh, wait a minute, do you want to come in here? Do you want to come in here? And I don't... part of me says they must do it because they're trying to hurt AEW. Part of me thinks they want to sign them because they're good talent. But I think it just reflects badly on WWE in general, doesn't it? One, you would say, what is your scouting department? What is your recruitment department like? You're talking over and over again, time and time again, about how great your recruitment is. And you go to all of these sporting events and these legitimate sporting events and powerlifting events and strongman events and the Olympics and the NFL Combine and all this kind of stuff. You go and searching for all of these talents, and you've still got people recruiting or scouting the independent scene and all this kind of stuff, and yet you have all of this talent appearing on AEW Dark or whatever, and suddenly you're like, we've never seen this guy before, we'll pick up the phone. And it's a bit like, well, what are you trying? What are you trying to do? And universally, 9 times out of 10, everyone's picking AEW because they've already got a sense of loyalty to AEW. They're like, well, AEW gave me a chance when WWE hadn't in the past. So all of that, again, and that's not the first time we've heard this story. It really isn't, and I find it fascinating. I really find it fascinating. I really do. The AEW Thunderdome. Could you imagine that? Well, Tony Khan was actually offered a similar kind of process to the WWE Thunderdome, and he turned it down because in a recent interview with UPI.com, AEW chairman, CEO, and head of creative Tony Khan revealed that the company resisted an internal push for a Thunderdome-type video wall on AEW programming. Now, at the start of the pandemic last year, Tony Khan installed talents at ringside as a de facto crowd to add atmosphere to the shows. Now, this was a few months before WWE introduced virtual fans via the WWE Thunderdome. Now, Khan noted that the idea of utilizing a video wall was pitched internally, but he was strongly opposed to it. He said, quote, I didn't want to have a video wall, and I pushed back when I got pushed to do a video wall. It was a fine idea, and WWE did it, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. I respect it, it's good and it's economical, but I wanted to continue to find a way to do the shows for fans every single week, and the fans at Daily's Place that supported us. We built like a wrestling territory, having a weekly audience, and I'm really proud of that. Khan also reiterated his belief that having a live audience enhances the AEW product. He said, early in the pandemic, I was like, let's create the experience of a drive-in movie. Let's the fans make for a better product. We're finally seeing ringside seats again, and be doing that for every week going forward, of course, as they return to touring. So I think that's a really interesting story. Look, the Thunderdome wasn't just exclusive to WWE, of course. We saw it in the NBA. We've seen it in numerous other sports. And I'm sure AEW, if they'd have done their own version of the AEW Thunderdome, it would have been fine. Looking back on it in retrospect, it was probably a good idea they didn't. AEW, a lot of things in the pandemic, people forget about this, but it's true. A lot of things early on in the pandemic, they got right earlier than WWE. They shifted the hard camera and the setup around at Daily's Place. WWE, of course, in those first Performance Center shows had the hard camera facing the empty stands. A couple of weeks later, after watching some of the AEW shows, the empty arena AEW shows, wouldn't you know it, suddenly they have the hard camera facing the entrance ramp in the same way that AEW did WWE. But look, the Thunderdome, I know obviously last night was the last Thunderdome pay-per-view for Hell in a Cell, and a lot of people are saying good riddance and all that kind of stuff. Look, just good riddance to the pandemic, right? And we are, we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel. We are going back to touring and having live fans back, which is great. But the Thunderdome absolutely served a purpose. It was far, far, far and away better than those empty arena Performance Center shows, even those shows that had the talent surrounding the ringside of the Performance Center, that it just didn't feel big. It didn't feel what you would associate with WWE. And I think AEW, throughout the pandemic, have done an excellent job. They did. They've, created an atmosphere by having the talents at ringside. They've brought fans back early, and maybe earlier than myself, I would have appreciated, because it was a bit like, at certain points in the pandemic, you still felt a bit uneasy with it all. But AEW have done a very good job. And I think, again, in retrospect, they probably had it was a good reason to turn down the Thunderdome, to differentiate themselves from WWE. And look, WWE, when they first installed that Thunderdome as well, the amount amount of problems they had with people getting onto the streams or having bad experiences, or some of the really controversial stuff they were posting on there, which I certainly didn't appreciate, that AEW would have had a similar problem. And maybe AEW just doesn't have the facility to cope with all of that, So, again, in retrospect, I think it was probably a good move. Anthony Bowens has spoken about the inclusivity in AEW and how that helped convince him to sign with AEW. Now, of course, Anthony Bowen is an openly gay man, and he's a member of the LGBT community. Now, again, he spoke about this and how being in AEW and having the inclusive nature of the AEW locker room was what really drew him to sign with the promotion. While there were other factors, he did confirm that the inclusive nature of the locker room was largely the case in his signing. He said, quotes, yes, when I did Dark back in October, outside of me enjoying the product in general, I enjoyed how inclusive the locker room was. I saw Sonny Kiss walking around, Nyla walking around. They were just being themselves. Everyone was laughing and chatting, and there wasn't this pressure on you to hide. You were just free to be yourself, and that's one of the things I love the most and made me want to be there. I like the fact they don't force anything. They just allow you to be you. Sonny is Sonny. Nyla is just Nyla. I'm just myself, and I think that's the way it should be. No kind of disingenuous forcing any kind of issue down people's throats or anything like that. It's just natural, and that's what I appreciate the most, I guess, about the scenario. And to be honest, I think he's spot on. I think he's absolutely spot on about that case. Even though we're in 2021, and it shouldn't be an issue in terms of being an openly, gay person, or a trans person, or whatever your orientation is, whatever your choices are, whatever your biological tendencies are, whatever. It shouldn't be an issue, but unfortunately, it still is in the minds of some. And AEW, their inclusive roster, I think, is fantastic. And I also agree with him to the point of inclusive, but to the point of, again, he's like he's saying, he's just being himself. They're not AEW. They don't make a massive deal out of it. They just be themselves, and that's who they are. They're just themselves. And I think Anthony Bowens does a fantastic job as part of the Acclaimed. I think they are going to be tag team champions in the next year or so because they're just that popular. So I think that's great comments by Anthony Bowens there. Finally, AEW star Allie has revealed she wants Rosemary to sign with AEW. Of course, Rosemary is a member of the Impact Wrestling roster. They have history from when they were both in Impact Wrestling. They were also part of a divisive storyline in 2018-2019 where the AEW star known as Allie back then was possessed by Rosemary. The story culminated in the bunny, which is now known as, I still call her Allie because I hate that bunny name, dying. She was written off in Rosemary's arms, thus ending her stint. She was one of the characters actually written off, and a lot of people did not like that. But appearing on the AEW Restricted podcast, she spoke about her desire to see Rosemary in AEW. She stated that some of the best matches and moments in her career have involved the former Knockouts champion. She said, quote, "It would be a dream come true to work alongside Rosemary again as a partner. It would also be a dream come true to feud with her again because all of my favorite matches, my all-time favorite feud in my entire career has been against Rosemary. She's amazing and she's one of my best friends. Selfishly, if I could drag her here, I would, and put her right next to me, and then maybe we'd also fight." I would be really, really surprised if that's the case. Again, I think that Rosemary is just absolutely fine where she is. I think she does a tremendous job in Impact Wrestling. And frankly, the Impact Wrestling Knockouts division is right up there with one of the best women's divisions in the world. So whilst it would be great to see Allie and Rosemary back together sometime soon, I don't think that's going to happen. But look, guys, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on all of these AEW news stories we've spoken about today? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about AEW, Impact Wrestling, New Japan Pro Wrestling, WWE, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved in the community. Drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube. Got the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestling News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or have you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.